Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 19. The Disintegrating Superblocs. The chief consequence of the nuclear stalemate was that it made possible a greatly increased diversity in the world. The mutual cancellation of the strength of the two superblocs made a situation in which states with little or no power were able to play significant roles on the world stage. At the same time, the superpowers were not even in a position to press their desires on the members of their own blocs, and the neutrals could act with growing neutrality, or even growing irresponsibility. Examples of such behavior could be seen in France, Pakistan, or Red China, among the members of the two blocs, or in the Congo, or the Arab states among the neutrals. Accordingly, the next divisions of our subject must be concerned with the disintegration of the superblocs and the growth of neutralism. Latin America, a race between disaster and reform. As time remorselessly moves forward through the second half of the 20th century, a major problem for the United States is the fate of Latin America, the gigantic portion of the Western Hemisphere that is south of the Rio Grande. It is not an area that can continue to be ignored because it is neither small nor remote, and its problems are both urgent and explosive. Yet, until 1960, it was ignored. The Latin America that demanded attention in 1960 was twice the size of the United States, 7.5 million square miles compared to 3.6 million square miles, with a population about 10% larger, 200 million persons, compared to our 180 million in 1960. Brazil, which spoke Portuguese rather than Spanish, had almost half the total area, with more than a third the total population, 75 million in 1960. In 1960, Brazil reached the end of a decade of economic and population expansion, during which its economy was growing at about 7% a year, while its population was growing over 2.5% a year, both close to the fastest rates in the world. The population increase of Asia was about 1.8% a year. Russia and the United States were less, while Europe was only 0.7% a year. Brazil's rate of economic growth fell to about 3% a year after 1960, while its population explosion became worse, apparently trying to catch up with the Brazilian cost of living, which rose 40% in 1961, 50% in 1962, and 70% in 1963. Except for its fantastic price inflation, Brazil's problems were fairly typical of those faced by all of Latin America. These problems might be boiled down to four basic issues. 1. Falling death rates, combined with continued high birth rates, are producing a population explosion, unaccompanied by any comparable increase in the food supply. 2. The social disorganization resulting from such population increase, combined with the flooding of people from rural areas into urban slums, is reflected in disruption of family life, spreading crime and immorality, totally inadequate education and other social services, and growing despair. 3. The ideological patterns of Latin America, which were always unconstructive, are being replaced by newer, equally unconstructive, but explosively violent doctrines. And 4. There is simultaneously an unnecessary spreading of modern weapons and a growing disequilibrium between the control of such arms and the disintegrating social structure and the increasing social and political pressures just mentioned. Some of the more obvious consequences of these four problems might be mentioned here. Latin America is not only poverty-ridden, but the distribution of wealth and income is so unequal that the most ostentatious luxury exists for a small group side by side with the most degrading poverty for the overwhelming majority, with a growing but very small group in between. The average yearly per capita income for all of Latin America was about $253 in 1960, ranging from $800 in Venezuela to $95 in Paraguay and $70 in Haiti. The distribution is so unequal, however, that 4/5 of the population of Latin America get about $53 a year, while a mere 100 families own 9/10 of the native-owned wealth of the whole area, and only 30 families own 72% of that wealth. This disequilibrium is seen most clearly in landholding, on which more than half the population, because of the area's economic backwardness, is dependent. Agrarian reform, land redistribution, which seems attractive to many, but is really no solution so long as the peasants lack capital and technical know-how, has been carried out, to some extent, in a few countries such as Mexico or Bolivia. But in Latin America, generally, landholding is still very unequal. In Brazil, for example, half of all land is owned by 2.6% of the landowners, while 22.5% of all the land is held by only 0.5% of the owners. In Latin America, as a whole, at least 2/3 of the land is owned by 10% of the families. Such inequality attracts a good deal of criticism, especially by North American reformers. But in itself, it would be good and not bad if the wealthy owners felt any desire or obligation to make the land produce more. But the greatest bane of Latin American life, as it is in Spain also, is the self-indulgence of the rich that allows them to waste their large incomes in luxury and extravagance without any feeling of obligation to improve or even to utilize fully the resources they control. We shall return in a moment to the disastrous ideological patterns that lie behind this attitude. Almost equally indicative of an unhealthy society is the age distribution within that society and the failure to provide education and health protection. About half of Latin America's population is unproductive and a social burden on the other half because it falls into the two groups of the young, below 15 years, or the old, over 65 years. This compares with only 26% of the population in these dependent groups in the United States. Such a distribution, in a healthy society, would require very considerable direction of resources into such social services as education, health protection, and retirement security. All such services in Latin America are painfully inadequate. About 2/3 of Latin Americans are illiterate, and those who may be classified as literate have very inadequate schooling. The average Latin American has had less than 2 years of schooling, but like all averages, this one is misleading, since it covers both Paraguay, where very few children ever get near a school, and Castro's Cuba, where we are told illiteracy has been wiped out and all children of school age up to 15 are supposed to be in school. Leaving out these two countries, we find that in 1961, in 18 other Latin American countries, only 38% of the population had finished 2 years of school, while only 7% had finished primary school, and 1 out of 100 had attended a university. The inadequacy of health protection in Latin America is as startling as the inadequacy of education, but may not, in a wider frame, be so objectionable. For if health were better protected, more people would survive, and the problems of scarce food and scarce jobs would have reached the explosive point long ago. Unfortunately, this problem of health and death rates has a very great impact on humanitarian North American observers, with the consequence that a considerable portion of the funds for development provided by the Alliance for Progress since 1961 are aimed at reducing these evils of disease and death. since this effort is bound to be more successful than the much smaller funds aimed at increasing the food supply. The net consequence of these efforts will be to give Latin America more and hungrier people. As things stood in 1960, infant mortality varied between 20 and 35% in different countries. Even in the Latin American country with the lowest death rate for the first year of life, Uruguay, with 25 deaths per 1,000 births, the rate is 10 times as high as in the United States, 2.6 per 1,000, while in Latin America as a whole, it was 56 per 1,000, rising to about 90 per 1,000 in Guatemala. The expectation of life for a new baby in all Latin America is only 2/3 that in the United States, 44 years compared to 66 years. But in some areas, such as northeast Brazil, men are worn out from malnutrition and disease at age 30. While such conditions may rouse North Americans to outrage or humanitarian sympathy, no solution of Latin America's problems can be found by emotion or sentimentality. The problems of Latin America are not based on lack of anything, but on structural weaknesses. Solutions will not rest on anything that can be done to or for individual people, but on the arrangements of peoples. Even the greatest evil of the area, the selfish and mistaken outlook of the dominant social groups, cannot be changed by persuading individuals, but must be changed by modifying the patterns of social relationships that are creating such outlooks. The key to the salvation of Latin America and much of the rest of the world rests on the word patterns. Latin America has the resources, the manpower, the capital accumulation, even perhaps the know-how to provide a viable and progressive society. What it lacks are constructive patterns, patterns of power, of social life, and above all, of outlook, that will mobilize its resources in constructive rather than destructive directions. Failure to recognize that Latin America's weaknesses are not based on lack of substance, but on lack of constructive patterns, is one of the two chief reasons why the future of Latin America looks so discouraging. The other reason is failure to recognize that the chief problem in planning Latin America's future is that of establishing a constructive sequence of priorities. In fact, these two problems, obtaining constructive patterns and obtaining a constructive sequence of priorities, are the keys to salvation of all the underdeveloped and backward areas of the globe. We might sum up this general situation by saying that the salvation of our poor, harassed globe depends on structure and sequence, or on patterns and priorities. In applying these two paradigms to Latin American development, we shall find that the problem of priorities is much easier to solve than the problem of patterns. Obviously, the birth rate must decrease before any vigorous efforts are made to reduce the death rate, or the food supply must be increased faster than the population, and some provision must be made to provide peasants with capital and know-how before the great landed estates are divided up among them. Equally urgent is the caution that some provision for capital accumulation and its investment in better methods of production must be made before the present accumulation of excess incomes in the hands of the existing oligarchies is destroyed by redistribution of the incomes of the rich, who could invest it, to the poor, who could only consume it. It should be obvious, but unfortunately is not, that a major productive organization of resources should have priority over any effort to raise standards of living. And it should be equally obvious that Latin America's own resources, including its own capital accumulation and its own know-how, should be devoted to this effort before the responsibility for Latin American economic development is placed on the resources of North Americans or other outsiders. This last point might be amplified. We hear a great deal about Latin America's need for American capital and American know-how, when in fact The need for these is much less than the need for utilization of Latin America's own capital and know-how. The wealth and income of Latin America in absolute quantities is so great, and it is so inequitably controlled and distributed, that there is an enormous accumulation of incomes far beyond their consumption needs in the hands of a small percentage of Latin Americans. Much of these excess incomes are wasted, hoarded, or merely used for wasteful competition and ostentatious social display. This, as we shall see, is largely due to the deficiencies of Latin American personalities and character. The contrast from this point of view between England in the 18th and 19th centuries and Latin America in the 19th and 20th centuries is very instructive. In both cases, there was such a drastic inequity in the distribution of national incomes that the masses of the people were in abject poverty and probably getting poorer. But in England, there were groups benefiting from this inequality who eschewed all self-indulgence, luxury, or ostentatious display of wealth, and systematically invested their growing incomes in creating new and more efficient patterns of utilization of resources. This is in sharp contrast to the situation in Latin America, where such excess wealth, in the aggregate, is much greater than that being accumulated a century or more ago in England, but is very largely wasted and surely is not being used to create more productive patterns for utilization of resources, except in rare cases. The solution to this problem is not, as we have said, to redistribute incomes in Latin America, but to change the patterns of character and of personality formation so that the excess incomes will be used constructively and not wasted, nor simply redistributed and consumed. A similar situation exists in regard to foreign exchange. Alternatively, our compassion is stirred and our anger roused. A similar situation exists in regard to foreign exchange. Alternatively, our compassion is stirred and our anger aroused by American reformers and Latin agitators at the inequities of the colonial character of Latin America's position in the world economy. This simply means that Latin America exports raw materials, minerals, and agricultural products, generally unprocessed goods, and imports processed manufactured goods, since the prices of unprocessed goods are generally more competitive and therefore more fluctuating than those of manufactured goods. The so-called terms of trade tend to run either favorably for or very unfavorably against Latin America. In the latter case, which has been generally prevalent for the last few years, the prices Latin America has to pay on the world's markets have tended to rise, while the prices that it gets for its own goods have tended to fall. As European economists would say, the blades of the scissors have opened. American farmers who speak of the terms of parity have been suffering the same way in the American domestic market. Now, this is perfectly true. The Latin American economy is largely a colonial one, like Australia, New Zealand, West Africa, or Montana. In fact, in Latin America, in recent years, at least half the value of American aid has been wiped away by the worsening of Latin America's terms of trade, which made it necessary for it to pay more and more foreign monies for its imports, at the same time that it got less and less foreign monies for its exports. But the fact remains that this reduction in the supply of foreign exchange available for Latin America's purchases of advanced equipment overseas has been made much worse by the fact that the wealthy Latin Americans buy up much of the available supply of such foreign exchange for self-indulgent and non-constructive spending abroad, or simply to hoard their incomes in politically safer areas in New York, London, or Switzerland. Estimates of the total of such Latin American hoards abroad range between $1 billion and $2 billion. The solution to this problem must be found in more responsible, more public-spirited, and more constructive patterns of outlook, of money flows, and of political and social security. A similar solution must be found for some of the social deficiencies of Latin America, such as inadequate education, housing, and social stability. Widespread tax evasion by the rich, bribery and corruption in public life, and brutality and selfishness in social life can be reduced and largely eliminated in Latin America by changing patterns in Latin American life and utilization of resources without much need for funds, sermons, or demonstrations from foreigners, least of all Americans. This is not an argument for a reduction in American aid or in American concern for Latin America. It is a plea for recognition by all concerned that the problems of Latin America and the possible solutions to these problems rest on questions of structure and sequence and not on questions of resources, wealth, or even know-how. The connection of the last word, know-how, to the whole problem may not be sufficiently clear. We Americans have such pride in our technological achievements that we often seem to feel that we know how to do almost everything. But this know-how really exists on two levels. One level is concerned with general attitudes such as objectivity, rationality, recognition of the value of social consensus, and such, while the other level is concerned with technological achievement in any specific situation. The former level has a great deal to contribute to the Latin American situation, while the latter level, the engineering level, so to speak, has much less to contribute to Latin America than most people believe. For example, American agricultural techniques which are so fantastically successful in the temperate seasonal climate and well-watered and alluvial soils of North America are frequently quite unadapted to the tropical, less seasonal climate and semi-arid, leached soils of South America. The solution to the Latin American problem of food production is not necessarily to apply North American techniques to the problem, but to discover techniques different from our own that will work under Latin American conditions. This situation applied here to agriculture is even more true of social and ideological problems. The problem of finding constructive patterns for Latin America is much more difficult than the problem of finding constructive priorities. One reason for this is that the unconstructive patterns that now prevail in Latin America are deeply entrenched as a result of centuries and even millennia of persistent background. In fact, the Latin American patterns that must be changed because today they are leading to social and cultural disruption are not really Latin American in origin, or even Iberian for that matter, but are Near Eastern and go back for some of their aspects for 2,000 or more years. As a general statement, we might say that the Latin American cultural pattern, including personality patterns and general outlook, is Arabic, while its social pattern is that of Asiatic despotism. The pattern as a whole is so prevalent today, not only in Latin America, but in Spain, Sicily, southern Italy, the Near East, and in various other areas of the Mediterranean world, such as Egypt, that we might call it the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. For convenience of analysis, we shall divide it into Asiatic despotism and the Arabic outlook. We have already indicated the nature of Asiatic despotism in connection with traditional China, the old Ottoman empires, and Tsarist Russia. It goes back to the archaic Bronze Age empires which first appeared in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and northern China before 1000 BC. Basically, such an Asiatic despotism is a two-class society in which a lower class, consisting of at least 9/10 of the population, supports an upper ruling class consisting of several interlocking groups. These ruling groups are a governing bureaucracy of scribes and priests, associated with army leaders, landlords, and moneylenders. Such an upper class accumulated great quantities of wealth as taxes, rents, interest on loans, fees for services, or simply as financial extortions. The social consequences were either progressive or reactionary, depending on whether this accumulated wealth in the possession of the ruling class was invested in more productive utilization of resources or was simply hoarded and wasted. The essential character of such an Asiatic despotism rests on the fact that the ruling class has legal claims on the working masses and possesses the power, from its control of arms and the political structure, to enforce these claims. A modified Asiatic despotism is one aspect of the social structures all along the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. The other aspect of the Pakistani-Peruvian axis rests on its Arabic outlook. The Arabs, like other Semites who emerged from the Arabian desert at various times to infiltrate the neighboring Asiatic despotic cultures of urban civilizations, were originally nomadic tribal peoples. Their political structure was practically identical with their social structure and was based on blood relationships and not on territorial jurisdictions. They were warlike, patriarchal, extremist, violent, intolerant, and xenophobic. Like most tribal peoples, their political structure was totalitarian in the sense that all values, all needs, and all meaningful human experience was contained within the tribe. Persons outside the tribal structure had no value or significance, and there was no obligations or meaning associated in contacts with them. In fact, they were hardly regarded as human beings at all. Moreover, within the tribe, social significance became more intense as blood relationships became closer, moving inward from the tribes through clans to the patriarchal extended family. The sharp contrast between such a point of view and that associated with Christian society as we know it can be seen in the fact that such Semitic tribalism was endogamous, while the rule of Christian marriage is exogamous. The rules, in fact, were directly antithetical, since Arabic marriage favors unions of first cousins, while Christian marriage has consistently opposed marriage of first or even second cousins. In traditional Arabic society, any girl was bound to marry her father's brother's son if he and his father wanted her, and she was usually not free to marry someone else until he had rejected her, sometimes after years of waiting. In such traditional Arabic society, the extended family, not the individual, was the basic social unit. All property was controlled by the patriarchal head of such a family, and accordingly, most decisions were in his hands. His control of the marriage of his male descendants was ensured by the fact that a price had to be paid for a bride to her family, and this would require the patriarch's consent. Such a patriarchal family arose from the fact that marriage was patrilocal, the young couple residing with the groom's father so long as he lived, while he continued to live with the groom's paternal grandfather until the latter's death. Such a death of the head of an extended family freed his sons to become heads of similar extended families that would remain intact, frequently for 3 or more generations, until the head of the family dies in his turn. Within such a family, each male remains subject to the indulgent, if erratic, control of his father and the indulgent and subservient care of his mother and unmarried sisters, while his wife is under the despotic control of her mother-in-law until her production of sons and the elimination of her elders by death will make her a despot, in turn, over her daughters-in-law. This Arabic emphasis on the extended family as the basic social reality meant that larger social units came into existence simply by linking a number of related extended families together under the nominal leadership of the patriarch, who, by general consensus, had the best qualities of leadership, dignity, and social prestige. But such unions, being personal and essentially temporary, could be severed at any time. The personal character of such unions and the patriarchal nature of the basic family units tended to make all political relationships personal and temporary, reflections of the desires or whims of the leader and not the consequence or reflection of any basic social relationships. This tended to prevent the development of any advanced conception of the state, law, and the community, as achieved, for example, by the once tribal Greeks and Romans. Within the family, rules were personal, patriarchal, and often arbitrary and changeable, arising from the will and often from the whims of the patriarch. This prevented the development of any advanced ideas of reciprocal common interests, whose interrelationships, by establishing a higher social structure, created at the same time rules superior to the individual, rules of an impersonal and permanent character, in which law created authority, and not, as in the Arabic system, authority created law, or at least temporary rules. To this day, the shattered cultures along the whole Pakistani-Peruvian axis have a very weak grasp of the nature of a community or of any obligation to such a community, and regard law and politics as simply personal relationships, whose chief justification is the power and position of the individual who issues the orders. The state, as a structure of force, more remote and therefore less personal than the immediate family, is regarded as an alien and exploitative personal system to be avoided and evaded simply because it is more remote, even if of similar character, than the individual's immediate family. This biological and patriarchal character of all significant social relationships in Arab life is reflected in the familiar feature of male dominance. Only the male is important, the female is inferior, even subhuman, and becomes significant only by producing males. The one thing, apparently, that the dominant male cannot do for himself. Because of the strong patrilocal character of Arab marriage, a new wife is not only subjected sexually to her husband, she is also subjected socially and personally to his family, including his brothers, and above all, his mother, who has gained the position of domination over other females in the house by having produced male children. Sex is regarded almost solely as simply a physiological relationship with little emphasis on the religious, emotional, or even social aspects. Love, meaning concern for the personality or developing potentialities of the sexual partner, plays little role in Arabic sexual relationships. The purpose of such relationships in the eyes of the average Arab is to relieve his own sexual desire or to generate sons. Such sons are brought up in an atmosphere of whimsical, arbitrary personal rules, where they are regarded as superior beings by their mother and sisters, and inevitably by their father and themselves, simply on the basis of their maleness. Usually they are spoiled, undisciplined, self-indulgent, and unprincipled. Their whims are commands. Their urges are laws. They are exposed to a dual standard of sexual morality in which any female is a legitimate target of their sexual desires, but the girl they marry is expected to be a paragon of chaste virginity. The original basis for this emphasis on a bride's virginity rested on the emphasis of blood descent and was intended to be a guarantee of the paternity of children. The wife, as a child-producing mechanism, had to produce the children of one known genetic line and no other. This emphasis on the virginity of any girl who could be regarded as acceptable as a wife was carried to extremes. The loss of a girl's virginity was regarded as an unbearable dishonor by the girl's family, and any girl who brought such dishonor on a family was regarded as worthy of death at the hands of her father and brothers. Once she is married, the right to punish such a transgression is transferred to her husband. To any well-bred girl, her premarital virginity and the reservation of sexual access to her husband's control after marriage, her honor, have pecuniary value. Since she has no value in herself as a person apart from her honor, and has little value as a worker of any sort, Her virginity before marriage has a value in money equal to the expense of keeping her for much of her life, since, indeed, this is exactly what it was worth in money. As a virgin, she could expect the man who obtained her in marriage to regard that asset as equivalent to his reciprocal obligation to support her as a wife. As a matter of fact, her virginity was worth much less than that. For in traditional Arabic society, if she displeased her husband, even if she merely crossed one of his whims, he could set her aside by divorce, a process very easy for him, with little delay or obligation, but impossible to achieve on her part, no matter how eagerly she might desire it. Moreover, once her virginity was gone, she had little value as a wife or a person, unless she had mothered a son, and could be passed along from man to man, either in marriage or otherwise, with little social obligation on anyone's part. As a result of such easy divorce, and the narrow physiological basis on which sexual relationships are based, plus the lack of value of a woman once her virginity is gone, Arab marriage is very fragile, with divorce and broken marriage about twice as frequent as in the United States. Even the production of sons does not ensure the permanence of the marriage, since the sons belong to the father, whatever the cause of the marriage disruption. As a result of these conditions, marriage of several wives in sequence, a phenomena we associate with Hollywood, is much more typical of the Arabic world and is very much more frequent than the polygamous marriage, which, while permitted under Islam, is quite rare. Not more than 5% of married men in the Near East today have more than one wife at the same time, because of the expense, but the number who remain in monogamous union till death is almost equally small. As might be expected in such a society, Arabic boys grow up egocentric, self-indulgent, undisciplined, immature, spoiled, subject to waves of emotionalism, whims, passion, and pettiness. The consequence of this, for the whole Pakistani-Peruvian axis, will be seen in a moment. Another aspect of Arabic society is its scorn of honest, steady manual work, especially agricultural work. This is a consequence of the fusion of at least three ancient influences. First, the archaic bureaucratic structure of Asiatic despotism, in which peasants supported warriors and scribes regarded manual workers, especially tillers of the soil, as the lowest layer of society, and regarded the acquisition of literacy and military prowess as the chief roads to escape from physical drudgery. Second, the fact that classical antiquity, whose influence on the subsequent Islamic civilization was very great, was based on slavery, and came to regard agriculture, or other manual work, as fit for slaves, also contributed to this idea. Third, the Bedouin tradition of pastoral, warlike nomads scorned tillers of the soil as weak and routine persons of no real spirit or character, fit to be conquered or walked on, but not to be respected. The combination of these three formed the lack of respect for manual work that is so characteristic of the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. Somewhat similar to this lack of respect for manual work are a number of other characteristics of traditional Arab life that have also spread the length of the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. The chief source of many of these is the Bedouin outlook, which originally reflected the attitudes of a relatively small group of the Islamic culture, but which, because they were a superior conquering group, came to be copied by others in the society, even by the despised agricultural workers. These attitudes included lack of respect for the soil, for vegetation, for most animals, and for outsiders. These attitudes, which are singularly ill-fitted for the geographic and climatic conditions of the whole Pakistani-Peruvian area, are to be seen constantly in the everyday life of that area as erosion, destruction of vegetation and wildlife, personal cruelty and callousness to most living things, including one's fellow men, and a general harshness and indifference to God's creation. This final attitude, which well reflects the geographic conditions of the area, which seem as harsh and indifferent as man himself, is met by those men who must face it in their daily life as a resigned submission to fate and to the inhumanity of man to man. Interestingly enough, these attitudes have successfully survived the efforts of the three great religions of ethical monotheism native to the area to change these attitudes. The ethical sides of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam sought to counteract harshness, egocentricity, tribalism, cruelty, scorn of work, and of one's fellow creatures by these efforts. But these efforts, on the whole, have met with little success throughout the length of the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. Of the three, Christianity, possibly because it set the highest standards of the three, has fallen furthest from achieving its aims. Love, humility, brotherhood, cooperation, the sanctity of work, the fellowship of the community, the image of man as a fellow creature made in the image of God, respect for women as personalities and partners of men, mutual helpmates on the road to spiritual salvation, and the vision of our universe, with all its diversity, complexity, and multitude of creatures as a reflection of the power and goodness of God. These basic aspects of Christ's teachings are almost totally lacking throughout the Pakistani-Peruvian axis, and most notably absent on the Christian portion of that axis from Sicily, or even the Aegean Sea, westward to Baja California and Tierra del Fuego. Throughout the whole axis, human actions are not motivated by these Christian virtues, but by the more ancient Arabic personality traits, which became vices and sins in the Christian outlook: harshness, envy, lust, greed, selfishness, cruelty, and hatred. Islam, the third in historical sequence of the ethical monotheistic religions of the Near East, was very successful in establishing its monotheism, but had only very moderate success in spreading its version of Jewish and Christian ethics to the Arabs. These moderate successes were counterbalanced by other incidental consequences of Muhammad's personal life and of the way in which Islam spread to make the Muslim religion more rigid, absolute, uncompromising, self-centered, and dogmatic. The failure of Christianity in the areas west from Sicily was even greater and was increased by the spread of Arab outlooks and influence to that area, and especially to Spain. The old French proverb, which says that Africa begins at the Pyrenees, does not, of course, mean by Africa that black Africa which exists south of the deserts, but means the world of the Arabs which spread in the 8th century across Africa from Sinai to Morocco. To this day, the Arab influence is evident in southern Italy, northern Africa, and above all in Spain. It appears in the obvious things such as architecture, music, the dance, and literature. But most prominently it appears in outlook, attitudes, motivations, and value systems. Spain and Latin America, despite centuries of nominal Christianity, are Arabic areas. No statement is more hateful to Spaniards and Latin Americans than that. But once it is made, and once the evidence on which it was based is examined in an objective way, it becomes almost irrefutable. In Spain, the Arab conquest of 711, which was not finally ejected until 1492, served to spread Arab personality traits in spite of the obvious antagonism between Muslim and Christian. In fact, the antagonism helped to build up those very traits that I have called Arabic: intolerance, self-esteem, hatred, militarization, cruelty, dogmatism, rigidity, harshness, suspicion of outsiders, and the rest of it. The Arab traits that were not engendered by this antagonism were built up by emulation. The tendency of a conquered people to copy their conquerors, no matter how much they profess to hate them, simply because they are a superior social class. From this emulation came the Spanish and Latin American attitudes towards sex, family structure, and child rearing that are the distinctive features of Spanish-speaking life today, and that make Spanish-speaking areas so ambiguously part of Western civilization, in spite of their nominal allegiance to such an essential Western trait as Christianity. For the West, even as it nominally ceases to be Christian, and most obviously in those areas which have at least nominally drifted furthest from Christianity, still has many of the basic Christian traits of love, humility, social concern, humanitarianism, brotherly care, and future preference. However detached these traits may have become from the Christian idea of deity or of individual salvation in a spiritual eternity. In Latin America, the Mediterranean vision of Arabized life again found its traits preserved and sometimes reinforced by the historical process. In Latin America, non-Spanish influences, chiefly Indian, Negro, and North American, can be observed in such things as music, dances, superstitions, agricultural crops, and diet, largely Indian, or in transportation, communications, and weapons, largely European. But the basic structure of family and social life, of ideological patterns and values, are, to this day, largely those of the Arabic end of the Pakistani-Peruvian axis. The Iberian conquest of Latin America, not as an area of settlement, but as an area of exploitation, and the Spanish attitude toward the Indians and Negro slaves as instruments in that exploitative process, the development of plantation colonialism and of mineral extraction, intensified the exploitative ransacking, extensive attitude toward resources and peoples which the Mediterranean area had obtained from the Romans and the Saracens. None of these activities became permanent community traits for those involved in them, even for the underlings who operated as part of the exploitative way of life, but remained temporary get-rich-quick methods for mercenary gain for persons who regarded themselves as strangers whose roots were elsewhere or nowhere. The Spanish oligarchy in the colonial period saw its roots in Spain itself, and this attitude widened somewhat to include Paris, London, the Riviera, or New York, has remained the attitude of the ruling oligarchy after the wars of liberation broke the formal links with Spain or Portugal. In the same way, and for these reasons, the colonial economy and colonialism in financial, educational, cultural, and commercial life has continued after it ceased in the narrowly political sphere. To this day, the characteristics we have listed as Arabic-dominant Latin America, no real concern for the soil, the area, for workers, one's fellow men, or the community as a whole, the dominance of family connection, and of masculine dominance with its dual standard of sexual morality, its cult of virility, its selfishness, self-indulgence, lack of self-discipline, or of concern for others, and the whole Mediterranean view of politics as a system of exploitative personal relationships, of an arbitrary and corrupt character, combining extortion, bribery, tax evasion, and total divorce from community spirit or personal responsibility for the welfare of others or of the nation. This picture of Latin America and its problems will be resented and criticized by many as exaggerated, one-sided, or even as mistaken. Naturally, in view of its brevity, it is oversimplified, as all brief expositions must be, and equally naturally, all its statements do not apply to all groups, all areas, all classes, or all individuals. There are numerous exceptions to large portions of this picture, but they are exceptions, and are explicable as such. And there are obviously different degrees of emphasis among various groups, backgrounds, and periods. These again are explicable. Those Latin Americans who are close to the Negro traditions of Africa and of slavery put more emphasis on present preference and sociability than they do on domination, harshness, and cruelty. Again, those Latin Americans who are close to the Indian tradition put more emphasis on resignation to fate and indigenous superstitions than they do on male dominance and proving their sexual virility, called machismo, a key concept in Latin American outlook and behavior. Above all, the scores of millions of Latin Americans who are on a poverty level at or even below subsistence have many of the characteristics of social and psychological disintegration that we associate with extreme poverty everywhere, even in the United States, and are, to a degree, unable to carry on the traditions of Latin American life, or any traditions. As such, they emphasize, interestingly enough, the traits of male dominance and egocentric selfishness rather than the companion traits in the Arab tradition of female chastity or family solidarity. In general, we might say that the Latin American tradition we have identified as a modified Arabic tradition with Asiatic despotic overtones is more typical of the oligarchic Spanish upper classes than it is of the Negro Indian or poverty-racked urban poor. And this is of the greatest significance, for this shows that the means and the method for the reform of Latin American society rest in the same group of that society. Such reform can come about only when the surpluses that accumulate in the hands of the Latin American oligarchy are used to establish more progressive utilization of Latin American resources. By the word reform, we mean that the power pattern, the economic and social pattern, and the ideological pattern be recognized in more constructive configurations rather than on the destructive patterns in which they now exist. And of these three, the patterns of ideology, that is, of outlook and value systems, are most in need of change. Of course, in any society, it is precisely this pattern of outlook and values that is most difficult to modify. In most societies, this remains unchanged, repeated in slogans, war cries, and religious incantations long after the behavioral and structural patterns have changed completely. In Latin America, there is this ray of hope. A more constructive ideological pattern is already familiar, at least in words, to Latin America: Christianity. The whole system is full of paradox and contradiction. The real obstacle to progress and hope in Latin America rests in the oligarchy, not so much because it controls the levers of power and wealth, but because it is absorbed in the destructive Latin American ideology. But the real hope in the area rests in the same oligarchy, because it controls wealth and power, and also because there is no hope at all unless it changes its ideology. The ideology it could adopt is one that places emphasis on self-discipline, service to others, love, and equality. But these virtues, almost wholly lacking in practice in Latin America, are the very ones that are in words embodied in the Christian religion, to which the oligarchy of Latin America nominally belongs. In a word, Latin America would be on the road to reform if it practiced what it preached. That is, if it tried to be Christian. Of course, we cannot really say that the solution lies in practice of what one preaches, the Christian virtues, because Latin American religion, like everything else, is largely corrupt, and as a consequence no longer preaches the Christian virtues. The upper clergy have been generally allied to the oligarchy, the lower clergy as poverty-stricken and almost as ignorant as their fellow poor in lay society. Moreover, both levels of clergy have come to accept the outlook and values of the society in which they live. The message of Christ itself, a positive message of action, has been lost in the negative messages of the Catholic clergy, reacting within a corrupt society drenched in the non-Christian outlook that dominates the oligarchy as a whole. Only in recent years has there been much change in this situation. In most of Latin America, the Church's failure is recorded in the fact that the great mass of Latin American people, especially those below the level of the oligarchy itself, ignore it or reject it, just as they do in Spain. And especially the dominant males have rejected it, except as a social necessity, or as an anti-revolutionary force, or as a refuge for their martyr-obsessed women. But the advent of Pope John the 23rd has had a profound influence on the Church by recalling it from its interests in crass power relationships to the content of Christ's message. The degree to which this can change the clergy's negative injunctions against adultery, communism, and criminal acts into positive exhortations to acts of social benefit, help, and love is problematic. And even more dubious is the question if it is not going to be too little, too late. This is indeed the great question with which all talk of reform in Latin America must end. Is there still time? There was time enough in 1940, when the demands of war in Europe began to push away the acute problems and controversies that had arisen from the World Depression, the rise of fascism, and the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. World War II, by increasing the demand for Latin American minerals and agricultural products, pushed starvation and controversy away from the immediate present and into the more remote future. Unfortunately, nothing constructive was done with the time thus gained, and almost equally tragic, little constructive use was made of the wealth brought to Latin America by the demands of war elsewhere on the globe. Latin America boomed. The rich became richer, the poor had more children. A few poor, or at least not rich, became rich, or at least richer. But nothing was done to modify the basic pattern of Latin American power, wealth, and outlook. The wars of independence that ended Latin America's political connection with Spain and Portugal did not destroy the power of the upper-class oligarchies or change their outlooks, except to make them somewhat more local. It was about a century, say from 1830 to 1930, before the oligarchic alliance of army, landlords, bankers, and upper-class clergy was seriously challenged in their exploitation of their peasant subjects or the natural resources of their local areas. This challenge, which first appeared in Mexico in 1910, was a consequence of the commercialization and, much later, the incipient industrialization of Latin American society. The same influences reinforced by other developments, such as growing literacy, population increase, and the introduction of new ideas of European and North American origin, served to weaken the union of the older oligarchic groups so that the solidarity of the military with the other three groups was much reduced. This process of commercialization and incipient industrialization of Latin American society was largely a consequence of foreign investments, which introduced railroads, tram lines, faster communications, large-scale mining, some processing of raw materials, and the introduction of electricity waterworks, telephones, and other public utilities, and the beginnings of efforts to produce supplies for these new activities. These efforts served to create two new and quite divergent social classes, which began to fill the gap between the older rural dichotomy of oligarchy and peasantry. The new classes, both largely urban, were labor and bourgeoisie. Both were infected by the class struggle ideologies of European socialist groups, so that the new laboring masses sought to be unionized and radical. Both groups were much more political than the old peasant class had ever been. A chief consequence of the whole development was the urbanization and radicalization of Latin American society. From the political point of view, these developments made the power relationships in Latin America much more complex and unpredictable. For one thing, the army was no longer completely dependent on the landlord groups for support, but found, on the contrary, that its urban bases were under pressure of local labor union controls of its supplies, while its relations with the bourgeois groups were much more ambiguous than its relations with the landlord group had been previously. At the same time, the influence of the clergy was generally weakened by the influx of anti-clerical ideas of European origin into both the new urban groups and, to a much smaller extent, to the peasants. These changes have not occurred in all areas of Latin America. Indeed, many areas remain much as they were in 1880. But in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, the process has gone far enough to modify the whole social pattern, while in some lesser areas like Bolivia, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and above all, Cuba, drastic changes have been occurring. In Mexico, the revolution has continued for more than half a century. During at least half of that period, the chief problem was the control of militarism, a task that must be done in all of Latin America. In its early days, the Mexican Revolution was distracted from constructive change by a number of destructive efforts. For example, its attacks on foreign capital led to more damage than good by curtailing foreign investment and foreign technological skills. At the same time, its emphasis on agrarian reform distracted attention from the real agricultural problem to the pseudo-problem of land ownership. The real problem is that of increasing agricultural production, regardless of agrarian arrangements. These three early problems have been to some extent overcome. The Mexican army is now largely professionalized and relatively non-political and responsive to civilian controls. For more than a generation now, the army has not overthrown a government. At the same time, political stability has been increased by the depersonalization of political life, by circulation of leadership within one dominant party, by the establishment of some political principles, including the very significant one of no re-election of the president, and by the use of political power to encourage some progressive tendencies, such as more public funds for education than for defense, encouragement of improved communications and transport, of foreign investment, and of balanced economic development. Many acute problems remain, such as an exploding population, acute poverty, and a very low level of social welfare. But things have been moving, and in a hopeful direction. During the 2 decades before 1962, the gross national product rose over 6% a year, while industrial production rose more than 400% in that period. The political system itself is corrupt, with most elections jobbed by the dominant institutional Revolutionary Party. But at least the outlook for the average Mexican today is more hopeful than it was for his father a generation ago, or than it is for his contemporaries in much of the rest of Latin America. The problems of life have not been solved in Mexico, but valuable time has been won. Efforts of other countries to follow in Mexico's footsteps have been less successful and even disastrous. In Argentina, patterns of life have become less constructive during the last generation, despite the fact that Argentina has been less burdened with population and more endowed with resources than other countries in Latin America. But lack of moral principles and excess self-indulgence has betrayed all efforts to obtain better patterns of life. This was evident in the career of Juan de Perón, an army officer who came to power by a coup d'etat in 1943 and sought to base that control on an alliance of the military with the workers. He built up a strong labor movement, but his concern with maintaining his own power, his lack of any overall plan, and his basically unprincipled outlook led to a disintegration of his movement and his overthrow by his own military forces in 1955. The waste of resources by inefficiency and corruption under Perón has left Argentina disorganized and divided, with real power increasingly in the hands of the armed forces, if they could agree on anything, and with many people looking backward with regret to the more affluent days of Perón. The disintegration of Argentina, which lacked the basic problems that have haunted most Latin American countries, helps to demonstrate the significant role played in Latin American backwardness by unconstructive patterns. especially patterns of outlook. Argentina did not have such problems as excess population, lack of capital, poor or unbalanced resources, extreme poverty, social disorganization, or illiteracy, which is below 10%. But the argumentative and divisive nature of social attitudes is as prevalent in Argentina as elsewhere on the Pakistani-Peruvian axis, and is the consequence, along the whole length of that axis, of the egocentric and undisciplined way in which sons are brought up by their mothers. In all societies, individuals have traits in which they differ from other individuals, and traits in which they share. A highly civilized people like the English, by training of the young of all classes, until very recently, have tended to produce adults who emphasize the qualities they share and play down the qualities in which they differ, even in activities such as games, politics, or competitive business, where opposition is part of the rules. In Latin America, the opposite is true, as each person tries to emphasize his individuality by finding more and more features of his life, often artificial ones, that distinguish or oppose him to others. In Argentina, as elsewhere along the Pakistani-Peruvian axis, especially in Spain, this tendency has fragmented social life and led to extremism. Even groups that seem to have the most obvious common interests in Argentina, such as the armed forces or the urban middle classes, are hopelessly split and fluctuate from position to position. It is the splitting of these groups, especially of the middle classes, that has given such influence to Argentina to the labor unions of the left or the landlord group on the right. The middle classes in Argentina have been split into two political parties that refuse to cooperate. Together they could poll at least half the total vote in any election, but instead each obtains a quarter or less of the total vote and, refusing to join each other, must seek a majority by coalition with smaller extremist parties. The failure of Latin America to find solutions to its most urgent real problems are, thus, much more fundamental than the clichés of political controversy. The complexion of governments, or the presence or absence of revolutionaries. The words left, center, or right mean little in terms of solutions to Latin America's problems, since disorganization, corruption, violence, and fraud are endemic in all. Bolivia, which has had a revolutionary government of peasants and tin miners since 1952, is in a mess, and Nicaragua, which has been under control of a military-dominated oligarchy for almost 30 years, is in a similar mess. So long as any real solutions of Latin America's problems depend upon the slow building up of constructive patterns, including ideological patterns, no solution will be found in shifting power or property from one group to another, even if the beneficent group in such transfers is much larger. This failure of social and economic revolutions to achieve more constructive patterns is evident in Bolivia, Guatemala, and Cuba. Bolivia's problems always seemed hopeless. In 3 unsuccessful wars with Chile, Brazil, and Paraguay, from 1879 to 1935, it lost territory to its neighbors, including its only outlet to the sea. Its population of less than 3 million in 1950, 3.6 million a decade later, was crowded on its bleak western plateau, over 12,000 feet up, while its subtropical eastern lowlands were inhabited by only a few wild Indians. These lowlands, and its mineral resources, source of 95% of its foreign exchange, mostly from tin, were Bolivia's chief assets before the revolution of 1952, but the former were unused, while the tin earnings went chiefly to swell the foreign holdings of 3 greedy groups, Patiño and Aramayo, both Bolivian, and Hochschild, Argentine. Until the revolution, the Bolivians, mostly of Indian descent, who were treated as second-class persons working as semi-slaves in the mines or as serfs on the large estates, had a per capita annual income of about $100, one-fifth that of Argentina, and the lowest but two of the 21 Latin American countries. As might be expected, the majority were illiterate, sullen, and discouraged. The poor Bolivian performance in the Chaco War with Paraguay in 1932 to 1935 gave rise to national feeling, even among the Indians, and inspired a group of academic intellectuals led by Victor Paz Estensoro to found a new political party, the National Revolutionary Movement, MNR. Many of the younger officers of the Indian enlisted men sympathized with the movement, and it won the largest vote of any party, 45%, in the election of 1951. The older officers prevented the MNR from participating in the new government, but their junta split and was overthrown by an uprising in April 1952. Paz Estensoro returned from exile to become president, with Juan Lequin, leader of the Revolutionary Tin Miners Union, as chief aide. Within a year, pressure from the tin miners and from the peasants, campesinos, forced the new regime to nationalize the mines and to break up many of the large estates into small peasant holdings. Production of metals and of food both collapsed, the miners demanding more pay and shorter hours for less and less work, driving Bolivian costs of production above the world market price for tin, thus wiping out a major part of the country's foreign exchange earnings. These fell from 150,770,000, 96% from metals, in 1951, to 63,240,000, 86% from metals, in 1958. To make matters worse, as Bolivian costs of tin rose, the world price of tin collapsed in 1957, when the Soviet Union, for the first time, came into the world markets with low-priced tin. In these same years, Bolivia's production of food for the market, which had never been sufficient, was reduced by the transformation of large estates producing for market into small farms producing for subsistence. The nationalization of the railways used to export Bolivia's metals proved as disastrous as the nationalization of the mines, and by 1961, only 18 of 60 mainline locomotives were still functioning. As might be expected under such a regime, price inflation drove the value of Bolivia's monetary unit down from an official rate of 190 to the dollar in 1954 to an open market rate of 12,000 to the dollar in 1958. These problems could hardly be handled, even by a government that knew better, because of the popular pressures in a democratic country to live beyond the country's income. Fortunately, the final collapse did not occur, despite continued troubles from Juan Lequin's miners, because of the courageous efforts of Hernan Siles, president in 1956 to 1960, but unable to succeed himself constitutionally, and assistance from the United States. This increased from 4,853,000 in 1953 to 32,120,000 in 1958. Siles sought to encourage both workers and peasants to seek production increases as a preliminary to increased consumption, a monetary stabilization plan, freezing of wages even while prices were still rising, encouragement of peasants to join in larger groupings with increased emphasis on production for market rather than for subsistence, efforts to bring some of the fertile eastern lowlands into agricultural production, and largely unsuccessful efforts to stop the drastic fall in industrial productivity in order to obtain some goods that could be offered to the peasants in return for their increased production of food. To reduce political pressures from the miners, 10,000 of their total working force of 36,000 were relocated in a new sugar industry in Santa Cruz. But the problem remained critical. Manufactured goods fell from 55.7 million in 1955 to about 40 million in value in 1962, while agricultural goods for sale fell from 132.6 million to 118.7 million in 1959 to 1961. The struggle still goes on, showing, if any proof were needed, that radical reforms for sharing the wealth of the few among the many poor is not an easy or feasible method for settling Latin America's material problems. However, one asset from this Bolivian experiment does not appear in the statistics or on the balance sheets. Bolivia's intelligent and hard-working Indians, once hopelessly dull, morose, and sullen, are now bright, hopeful, and self-reliant. Even their clothing is gradually shifting from the older funeral black to brighter colors and variety. Few contrasts could be more dramatic than that between the Bolivian revolutionary government, in which a moderate regime was pushed toward radicalism by popular pressures and survived year after year with American assistance, and the Guatemala Revolution, where a communist-inspired regime tried to lead a rather inert population in the direction of increasing radicalism, but was overthrown by direct American action within 3 years, 1951 to 1954. Guatemala is one of the banana republics. This perishable fruit, with a world production of 26 billion pounds a year, forms 40% of the world's trade in fresh fruit, with almost 70% of the world's total produced in Latin America, and almost 57% of all the world's banana exports going to North America. The retail value of Latin America's part of the world's trade in bananas is several $billion a year, but Latin America gets less than 7% of that value. One reason for this is the existence of the United Fruit Company, which owns 2 million acres of plantations in 6 Latin American countries, with 1,500 miles of railroad, 60 ships, seaports, and communications networks. This corporation handles about a third of the world's banana sales, and about 2/3 of the American sales. It controls 60% of the banana exports of the 6 banana republics: Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, and accounts for over 40% of the foreign exchange earnings in 3 of the 6 countries. It pays about $145 million a year into the 6 countries and claims to earn about $26 million profits on its $159 million investments each year. But this profit figure of about 16.6% a year is undoubtedly far below the true figure. A United States suit against United Fruit in 1954 to 1958 claimed that the latter controlled 85% of the land suitable for banana cultivation in 5 countries, and ordered it to get rid of most of its subsidiary transportation, distribution, and land operations by 1970. At the time, about 95% of the land held by United Fruit was uncultivated. The antitrust consent decree, even if carried out, will not materially reduce United Fruit influence in Central America, since its relations with its subsidiaries can merely be shifted from ownership to contractual arrangements. Guatemala, like Bolivia, has a population that consists largely of impoverished Indians and mixed bloods, mestizos. From 1931 to 1944, these were ruled by the dictator Jorge Ubico, the last of a long line of corrupt and ruthless tyrants. When he retired to die in New Orleans in 1944, free elections chose Juan José Arvalo, 1945 to 1950, and Jacobo Arbenez Guzman, 1950 to 1954, as presidents. Reform was long overdue, and these 2 administrations tried to provide it, becoming increasingly anti-American and pro-communist over their 9-year rule. When they began, civil or political rights were almost totally unknown, and 142 persons, including corporations, owned 98% of the arable land. Free speech and press, legalized unions, and free elections preceded the work of reform. But opposition from the United States began as soon as it became clear that the Land Reform Act of June 1952 would be applied to the United Fruit Company. This act called for redistribution of uncultivated holdings above a fixed acreage or lands of absentee owners, with compensation from 20-year 3% bonds equal to the declared tax value of the lands. About 400,000 acres of United Fruit lands fell under this law and were distributed by the Arbenz Guzman government to 180,000 peasants. This and other evidence was declared to be communist penetration of the Americas, and John Foster Dulles, in a brief visit to the OAS meeting at Caracas in 1954, forced through a declaration condemning Guatemala. The Secretary of State left the execution of this condemnation to his brother, Allen Dulles, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, which soon found an American-trained and American-financed Guatemalan colonel, Carlos Castillo Armas, who was prepared to lead a revolt against Arbenz with American money and equipment, and even some American volunteers to fly surplus American planes. Armas mounted an attack of Guatemalan exiles from bases in two adjacent dictatorships, Honduras and Nicaragua. Both these countries are horrible examples of everything a Latin American government should not be: corrupt, tyrannical, cruel, and reactionary. But they won the favor of the United States Department of State by echoing American foreign policy at every turn. Nicaragua, often a target of American intervention in the past, was decayed, dirty, and diseased under the 20-year tyranny of Anastasio Somoza, 1936 to 1957. His sons, one of whom became president while the other served as commander of the oversized National Guard in 1963. The presidency was transferred to a Somoza stooge, René Schicht. From these despotic bases, the CIA directed assault of Colonel Armas, overthrew Arbenz Guzman in 1954, and established in Guatemala a regime similar to that of the Somozas. All civil and political freedoms were overthrown. The land reforms were undone, and corruption reigned. When Armas was assassinated in 1957, and a moderate elected as his successor, the army annulled those elections and held new ones, in which one of their own, General Miguel Ydagoras Fuentes, was elected. He liquidated what remained of Guatemala's socialist experiments by granting these enterprises, at very reasonable prices, to his friends, while collecting his own pay of $1,094,000 a year. Discontent from his associates led to a conservative army revolt against Ydagoras in November 1960, but American pressure secured his position. The United States, at the time, could not afford a change of regime in Guatemala, since that country was already deeply involved as the chief aggressive base for the Cuban exiles' attack on Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in April 1962. As we all know, the CIA's success in attacking communist Guatemala from dictatorial Nicaragua in 1954 was not repeated in its more elaborate attack on communist Cuba from dictatorial Guatemala in 1962. In fact, the Bay of Pigs must stand as the most shameful event in United States history since the end of World War II. But before we tell that story, we must examine its background in Cuba's recent history, a story that well exemplifies the tragedy of Cuba. The causes of the Cuban disaster are as complex as most historical events, but if we oversimplify, we may organize them in terms of two intersecting factors. One, the personality deficiencies of the Cubans themselves, such as their lack of rationality and self-discipline, their emotionalism and corruptibility. And two, the ignorance and ineptitude of the American State Department, which seems incapable of dealing with Latin America in terms of the real problems of the area, but instead insists on treating it in terms of America's vision of the world, which is to say in terms of American political preconceptions and economic interests. Cuba is more Spanish than much of Latin America, and obtained its independence from Spain only in 1898, 2 generations later than the rest of Latin America. Then, for over 30 years, until the abrogation of the Platt Amendment in 1934, Cuba was under American occupation, 1898 to 1902, or the threat of direct American intervention. During that period, the island fell under American economic domination by American investments on the island and by becoming deeply involved in the American market, especially for its sugar crop. In the same period, a local oligarchy of Cubans was built up, including an exploitative landlord group that had not existed previously. With the establishment of the Good Neighbor policy in 1933 and the ending of the threat of American direct intervention, it became possible for the Cubans to overthrow the tyrannical and bloody rule of General Garado Machado, which had lasted for 8 years, 1925 to 1933. The opportunity to begin a series of urgently needed and widely demanded social reforms under Machado's successor, Ramon Grau San Martin, was lost when the United States refused to recognize or to assist the new regime. As a result, a ruthless Cuban army sergeant, Fulgencio Batista, was able to overthrow Grau San Martin and begin a 10-year rule of the island, 1934 to 1944, through civilian puppets, chosen in fraudulent elections, and then directly as president himself. When Grau San Martin was elected president in 1944, he abandoned his earlier reformist ideas and became the first of a series of increasingly corrupt elected regimes over the next 8 years. The fourth such election, scheduled for 1953, was prevented when Batista seized power once again, in March 1952. The next 7 years were filled by Batista's efforts to hold his position by violence and corruption against the rising tide of discontent against his rule. One of the earliest episodes in that tide was an attempted revolt by a handful of youths, led by 26-year-old Fidel Castro, in eastern Cuba, on July 26, 1953. The failure of the rising of July 26th gave Castro 2 years of imprisonment and more than a year of exile. But at the end of 1956, he landed with a handful of men on the coast of Cuba to begin guerrilla operations against the government. Batista's regime was so corrupt and violent that many of the local powers of Cuba, including segments of the army and much of the middle class, were either neutral or favorable to Castro's operations. The necessary arms and financial support came from these groups, although the core of the movement was made up of peasants and workers led by young middle-class university graduates. This Castro uprising was not typical of the revolutionary coups that had been familiar in Cuba and throughout Latin America in an earlier day, because of Castro's fanatical thirst for power, his ruthless willingness to destroy property or lives in order to weaken the Batista's regime, and his double method of operation from within Cuba rather than from abroad, and from a rural base, the peasants rather than the usual urban base, the army, used by most Latin American rebels. By destroying sugar plantations and utilities, Castro's rebels weakened the economic and communications bases of the Batista government. The steady attrition of the regime's popular and military support made it possible for Castro's forces to advance across Cuba, and on New Year's Day 1959, he marched into Havana. Within 2 weeks, an additional and very ominous difference in this revolution appeared. The supporters of the Batista regime and dissident elements in Castro's movement began to be executed by firing squads. For a year, Castro's government carried on a reformist policy administered by his original supporters, the July 26th group of young middle-class university graduates. These reforms were aimed at satisfying the more obvious demands of the dispossessed groups who had provided the mass bases for Castro's movement. Military barracks were converted into schools. The militia was permanently established to replace the regular army. Rural health centers were set up. A full-scale attack was made on illiteracy. New schools were constructed. Urban rents were cut by half. Utility rates were slashed. Taxes were imposed on the upper classes. The beaches, once reserved for the rich, were opened to all, and a drastic land reform was launched. These actions were not integrated into any viable economic program, but they did spread a sense of well-being in the countryside, although they curtailed the building boom in the cities, especially Havana, largely rooted in American investment, and they instigated a flight of the rich from the island to refuge in the United States. Beneath this early and temporary bloom of well-being, many ominous signs appeared. Castro soon showed that he was a tactician of revolution and not a strategist of reconstruction. He not only proclaimed permanent revolution in Cuba, but at once sought to export it to the rest of Latin America. Arms and guerrilla fighters were sent and lost in unsuccessful efforts to invade Panama, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Failure of these turned him to methods of more subtle penetration, largely worked by propaganda and the arming and training of small subversive underground groups, especially in areas where democratic or progressive regimes seemed to be developing, as in Venezuela, under Betancourt, or Colombia, under Alberto, Yaris, Camargo. At the same time, an unsuccessful effort was made to persuade all Latin America to form an anti-Yankee front. Although the United States in October 1959 had promised to follow a policy of non-intervention toward Cuba, these changes within the island, and especially the long visit there of Soviet Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan in February 1960, forced a reconsideration of this policy. The Mikoyan Agreement promised Cuba petroleum, arms, and other needs for its sugar, although the price equivalent allowed for the sugar was only 4 cents a pound, at a time when the American price was 6 cents. By June 1963, when world sugar prices reached 13 cents, the USSR raised its price for Cuban sugar to 6 cents. This trade agreement was followed by establishment of diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in May and with Red China later in the year. The Soviet embassy in Havana became a source of communist subversion for all of Latin America, almost at once, while in September, Khrushchev and Castro jointly dominated the annual session of the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York. As part of the trade agreement with Russia, Castro obtained Soviet crude petroleum for Cuban sugar. When he insisted that American-owned refineries in Cuba process this oil, they refused and were at once seized by Castro. The United States struck back by reducing the Cuban sugar quota in the American market, which led, step by step, to Castro's sweeping nationalization of foreign-owned factories on the island. The United States retaliated by establishing a series of embargoes on Cuban exports to the United States. These controversies led Castro into an economic trap similar to that into which Nasser had fallen with Egypt's cotton. Each nationalist revolutionary leader committed his chief foreign exchange earning product, sugar or cotton, to the Soviet Union as payment for communist, often Czech, arms. This tied these countries to the Soviet Union and deprived them of the chance to use their one source of foreign money for equipment so urgently needed for economic improvement. By December 1960, when American diplomatic relations with Cuba were broken off, the Cuban economic decline had begun, and soon reached a point where standards of living were at least a third below the Batista level, except for some previously submerged groups. At the end of 1960, the Eisenhower administration decided to use force to remove Castro. This decision was a major error and led to a totally shameful fiasco. The error apparently arose in the Central Intelligence Agency and was based on a complex misjudgment of the apparent ease with which the agency had overthrown the Arbenz regime in Guatemala in 1954 by organizing a raid of exiles, armed and financed by the CIA. into Guatemala from Nicaragua. The CIA analyzed this apparently successful coup quite incorrectly, since it assumed that Arbenz had been overthrown by the raiding exiles, when he had really been destroyed by his own army, which used the raid as an excuse and occasion to get rid of him. But on this mistaken basis, the CIA in 1960 decided to get rid of Castro by a similar raid of Cuban exiles from Guatemala. This decision was worse than a crime. It was stupid. A unilateral, violent attack on a neighboring state with which we were not at war, in an area where we were committed to multilateral and peaceful procedures for settling disputes, was a repudiation of all our idealistic talk about the rights of small nations and our devotion to peaceful procedures that we had been pontificating around the world since 1914. It was a violation of our commitment to non-intervention in the Americas, and specifically in Cuba. In sequence to our CIA intervention in Guatemala, it strengthened the Latin American picture of the United States as indifferent to Latin America's growing demand for social reform and national independence, and as hostile to these when they conflicted with its own drives for wealth and power. Moreover, the attack on Cuba was ill-advised, at a time when Castro's prestige at home was rapidly dwindling, and when opposition was rising to his chaotic rule throughout the island. And finally, the whole operation patterned on Hitler's operations to subvert Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938 was bungled as Hitler could never have bungled anything. The project was very much of a Dulles brothers' job, and its execution was largely in the hands of the Central Intelligence Agency, which organized the expeditionary force from Cuban exiles, financed and armed them, and supervised their training in Guatemala and elsewhere. The plan of the invasion of Cuba seems to have been drawn on typical Hitler lines. The expeditionary force was to establish a beachhead in Cuba, set up a government on the island, be recognized by the United States as the actual government of Cuba, and ask Washington for aid to restore order in the rest of the island, which it did not yet control. The Joint Chiefs of Staff approved the plan, and President Kennedy was persuaded to accept it after his inauguration, because of the CIA's argument that something must be done to remove Castro before his newly acquired Soviet armaments became operational. The president was assured that if matters were allowed to go on as they were, Castro would be strengthened in power, which was untrue, and that the invasion would be a success because the Cuban people, led by the anti-Castro underground, would rise against him as soon as they heard of the landing. Whatever truth there was in this last contention, the CIA handling of the invasion made it impossible, because the CIA refused to use either the anti-Castro underground in Cuba or the Cuban refugees in the United States, except as volunteers to be targets in the invasion attempt, and kept all planning and control of the invasion in its own hands. The Executive Committee of Cuban Refugees in the United States, mostly representatives of the older ruling groups in Cuba, were eager to restore the inequitable economic and social system that had existed before Castro. They were alienated from the most vigorous anti-Castro groups in the Cuban underground, who had no desire to turn back the clock to the Machado Batista era, but wanted to free the social and economic reform movement from Castro, the communists, and the anti-democratic and totalitarian forces that had taken control of it. The CIA would not cooperate with the anti-Castro underground because it was opposed to their wish for social and economic reform, and it would not use the Miami Refugee Committee because it doubted either their discretion or fighting spirit. Accordingly, the CIA launched the invasion without notifying the Cuban underground, and kept the Refugee Committee locked up without communication for the week of the attack. Then the attack itself was bungled, since it was aimed at an inappropriate spot, without eliminating Castro's air power and without provisions for fighting it, and with the logistics for the whole tactical operation of the invasion at an unbelievable level of incompetence. As a result of these errors, the 1,500 men landed at the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba on April 17, 1961, were destroyed in 72 hours by Castro's speedily mobilized and well-armed militia. At the same time, Castro's police destroyed any possible simultaneous rising of the underground by arresting thousands of suspects. To do the wrong thing is bad, but to do it incompetently is unforgivable. The blow to American prestige from the Bay of Pigs was almost irretrievable. On the other hand, it greatly strengthened Castro's prestige in Latin America, more than in Cuba itself, and made it possible for him to bind the Kremlin to his cause so tightly that it could neither reduce its support nor control his policies. This in turn permitted him to survive a deepening wave of passive resistance and sabotage within Cuba itself, chiefly from the peasants. And finally, as we shall see, this made it possible for him to recapture control of the Cuban revolutionary movement for himself and the Fidelists from the Cuban communists. This last point was in March 1962, but the others began in 1961. Until the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Soviet commitment to Castro had been considerable, but not irretrievable. Soviet armaments began to arrive as early as July 1960, and in the first year exceeded 30,000 tons, valued at $50 million. As payment, the Communist bloc's portion of Cuba's export trade rose from 2% to 75%. Within a year of the failure at the Bay of Pigs, Sino-Soviet military support for Castro doubled. It also changed its quality to late-model anti-aircraft missiles, long-range missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, and even Soviet combat troops. By the time these changes became evident to Washington in October 1962, the Soviet military buildup in Cuba had cost over $700 million. Before this Soviet military buildup in Cuba reached its stage of most rapid acceleration in July-October 1962, a number of significant changes occurred in Cuba itself. Two of these were the growth of Cuban resistance to the Castro regime and Castro's acceptance and sudden reversal of a communist usurpation of his power within Cuba. Castro's efforts to take Cuba into the communist bloc began almost as soon as he took Havana in January 1959. His refusal to allow post-revolutionary elections to confirm his victory, a traditional Latin American tactic, and his outlawing of the traditional political parties, but not the communists, PSP, which had secretly cooperated with Batista for years, left him in an ideological and political vacuum. Soon, the closing down of all opposition newspapers, but the continued publication of the communist paper, Hoy, showed that only this group would fill the vacuum. And finally, the small group of old communists in Cuba were allowed to take over control of the administrative system, and within months had a reasonable facsimile of the Kremlin's arrangements operating from Havana. They took control of the rebel militia, especially G2, its intelligence branch. President Manuel Urrutia was removed for an anti-communist speech and replaced by a fellow traveler, Osvaldo Dorticos Torrado. A struggle between the communists and the Fidelists of the 26th of July movement for control of the Confederation of Cuban Labor Unions was settled by Castro himself in favor of the communists. A chief communist leader, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, professor of economics at the University of Havana, led a student revolt that gave the communists control of the university. All political movements were merged into the Integrated Revolutionary Organization, ORI, whose leadership was practically identical with the old communist leadership. This group set up communist-type cells in farms, factories, and government offices. Anibal Escalante, secretary of the Communist Party, became organizational secretary of ORI. The military secret police, G2, was transformed into a ministry of the interior, based on the Kremlin's MVD, with a communist Ramiro Valdez at its head. The lands that had been distributed or seized by peasants were nationalized by local communist groups, and many of the cooperative farms that had risen from these became collective farms. And many of the cooperative farms that had risen from these became collective farms. In all significant governmental posts, Fidelists were replaced or circumvented by communists. Control of the economy was taken from Major Ernesto Che Guevara and given to Professor Rodriguez, who became president of the Agrarian Reform Institute and drew up the economic development plans for the years following 1961. Thus, within a few months, the ORI became a real government, making most of the significant daily decisions, and Escalante was exercising more power than Castro. The latter, still the darling of the masses, spent much of his time rousing them to frenzy with his speech-making and marching. The chief resistance to this communization of Cuba came from the peasants by curtailing production and by sabotage. Smaller farmers produced enough for their families, but no more. In resistance to government fixed prices and the compulsion to sell all their marketable produce to the National Institute of Agrarian Reform. Farmers refused to labor on the collective or state farms and occasionally set fire to the cane brakes on these. A good part of the coffee crop of 1961 was lost because the workers refused to harvest it. Similar resistance arose with the sugar and other crops. Drastic food rationing had to be established in March 1962. The 1962 coffee crop was sabotaged, and coffee rationing had to be established in February 1963. Most critical was the sugar crop, source of 4/5 of Cuba's foreign exchange. Efforts to harvest the crop with the militia, students, or city workers failed, and by 1962 the crop harvested had fallen to about half of the pre-Castro figure. At the same time, the ending of almost all trade ties with the United States, which had been a principal source of Cuban food, left Cuba dependent on countries like the Communist bloc, which had difficulties feeding themselves. The food ration fell to 3/4 pound of meat a week per person and 5 eggs with 2 ounces of butter a month. The food shortage was soon followed by shortages of manufactured goods, as the exodus of technicians, lack of spare parts, and bureaucratic confusions disorganized industrial production. The economic collapse in no way discouraged Castro's efforts to establish a socialist regime, but the Communist Party's curtailment of his personal power led to a strong counteraction in March 1962. On May Day 1961, Castro had proclaimed that Cuba would be a socialist state, and in a 2-day speech on December 1st through the 2nd, 1961, he had announced his own Marxist-Leninist beliefs. This ended the earlier arguments, disseminated by American establishment circles, led by the New York Times, that Castro was simply a progressive reformer. But despite his statements, he was not in any way a convinced communist, or a convinced anything else, but was a power-hungry and emotionally unstable individual, filled with hatred of authority himself, and restless unless he had constant change and megalomaniac satisfactions. His tactical skill, especially in foreign affairs, is remarkable, and shows similarity to Hitler's. His allegiance to communism had nothing to do with ideological conviction or devotion to the Kremlin, but arose from his recognition that Russia was the only power in a position to counterbalance the United States, and was to him preferable to the United States, both because of its greater distance and because its ideological pretenses would never allow it to permit an admitted communist state like Cuba to be attacked by the United States. Thus, Castro sought to get the Soviet Union more deeply committed to Cuba, so that it could not disentangle itself whatever Castro did, but must protect him from the United States, even when he openly disregarded its advice. In the same way, Castro was willing to build up his indebtedness to the Soviet Union, because the communist commitment would not allow the Kremlin to do anything drastic to collect such a debt. For these reasons, Castro wished to join the Warsaw Pact, but this, at least Moscow, was able to prevent. At the same time, Castro recognized that his own adoption of the communist ideology would not weaken him in Latin America, where the impoverished masses care nothing about ideologies, and the middle classes, especially the youth and university students, like communism as an ideology, although it has little influence on their own actions or political behavior. Although the communist takeover in Cuba began in 1960, it was not until February 1962 that Castro began to realize what had happened. Within a month, particularly during the week of March 16th through the 22nd, he eliminated the communists from most positions of significant power. The Rodriguez Economic Plan of November 1961 was denounced. The ORI system was purged. His brother, Raúl Castro, was made vice premier. Escalante was forced into exile. The militia and bureaucracy were recaptured by the Fidelists. And on March 26th, Fidel himself gave a 5-hour speech narrating what had happened. Pravda did not accept the change until April 11th. This acceptance of the re-establishment of Fidelism by both the Kremlin and the Cuban Communist Party, largely because they had no alternative, was followed by their full-scale support of the Castro regime in political and economic policies. On May 31st, it was announced that Moscow would provide 600,000 tons of food in the balance of 1962 to stave off the Cuban economic collapse. And later Moscow released claims on some Cuban sugar so that it could be sold in the world market for hard currencies. Above all, the Soviet Union appeared to accept Castro's argument that another American military assault on Cuba was in preparation. The United States, Castro, and Moscow all must have known that no effort was likely to be made to repeat the American invasion of Cuba. But Castro made the charge because he wanted Soviet weapons, and the Kremlin pretended to believe it for reasons that are still doubtful. It is possible that the Russians hoped that the Soviet IRBMs in Cuba would help to slow up the increasing American lead over the Soviet Union in the missile race. It is also possible that they hoped that such missiles, once established, might be bargained away in return for a Soviet-favored solution to the Berlin question. The increasing American aerial patrols over Cuba, which detected the Russian missile buildup on the island, were used by Cuba and the Soviet Union as evidence of the approaching American attack. By September, still unknown to the public, the crisis began to form, and in October it was in full progress, with the consequences already described. The ending of the Cuban Missile Crisis at the end of 1962 may have opened a new era in the world's history, but it left Latin America still floundering in the same old problems, which became more complicated and insoluble with each passing day. As we have said, these problems can be solved only by obtaining more constructive patterns in the proper priority sequence. On the whole, the role of the United States in Latin America has not been such as to help either patterns or priorities, largely because our concern has been with what seems to be useful or better for us, rather than with what would be most helpful to them. From the point of view of Latin America's real interests, basic priorities might include 5 things. 1. More constructive psychological patterns. 2. Increased political stability. 3. A greatly reduced birth rate, with emphasis on the quality rather than on the quantity of population. 4. A large increase in the food supply and in the most fundamental needs of human life, such as housing. 5. Increased emphasis on light industry, especially processing and semi-processing of local raw materials. And 6. Continued improvements in transportation and communications. This combination of advances could provide rising standards of living and jobs for everyone. In moving in this direction, much greater use should be made of local resources, including local capital and local skills, especially those of the present upper classes. This last point will become feasible only if the first two points begin to develop. A better outlook, especially in the upper classes, and a sufficiently stabilized political system, so that duress can be put upon those classes to force them to use both their lives and their resources in a more constructive way. This will be possible only if the armed forces of Latin America and of the whole Pakistani-Peruvian axis move much more rapidly in a direction they have been moving in already, but too slowly. The direction of increased concern for stronger, more honest, more constructive, and more widely distributed improvements in conditions of living among their own people. This point of view has already shown itself along the Pakistani-Peruvian axis, in military circles in Pakistan, Egypt, Argentina, and elsewhere, in the royal entourage, in Iran, among university youth, in much of Latin America. But in all these circles, despite the enthusiasm and energy that make it possible for them to overthrow corrupt and tyrannical regimes, it soon becomes clear that they have little idea what to do once they get into power. As a result, they fall under the personal influence of unstable and ignorant men, the Nasirs, the Perons, and the Castros, who fall back on emotionally charged programs of hatreds and spectacular displays of unconstructive nationalism that waste time and use up resources, while the real problems of the whole enormous area go unsolved. A heavy responsibility rests on the United States for the widespread failure to find solutions to problems all the way from Pakistan to Peru. The basic reason for this is that our policies in this great area have been based on efforts to find solutions to our own problems rather than theirs, to make profits, to increase supplies of necessary raw materials, to fight Hitler, to keep out communism, and in recent years, to fight the Cold War and prevent the spread of neutralism. The net result of our actions has been that we are now more hated than the Soviet Union, and neutralism reveals itself as clearly as it dares through the whole area. This is perhaps more obvious on the Pakistan end of the axis than on the Peruvian end, but is true from one end to the other. Dulles' insistence on arming the Middle and Near East and seeking to line the area up into a military bulwark against the Soviet Union destroyed the precarious political stability of the area, intensified local rivalries and animosities, as between India and Pakistan or between Egypt and Israel, led to large-scale waste of resources and energies on armament rivalries, divided the armed forces into cliques whose rivalries increased the frequency of military coups, and often entrenched in power reactionary and unprogressive minorities. The sad thing about all this is that it was so unnecessary. There never was a moment in which the arms of this axis, excluding Turkey and Israel, contributed anything significant to keeping the Soviet Union out of it. Even less so in Latin America. On the contrary, the Dulles efforts to bring both areas into the Cold War in a military way by treaties and armaments have succeeded only in bringing Soviet influences and communism in by methods of subversion, propaganda, and economic penetration that cannot be excluded by military agreements and armaments. And at no time did these military agreements and armaments provide any real strength to keep Russia out as a military threat, for at all times the task rested on the deterrent power of the United States and the Western Alliance. The sole consequence of the Dulles effort to do the wrong thing along the Pakistani-Peruvian axis has been to increase what he was seeking to reduce: local political instability, increased communist and Soviet influence, neutralism, and hatred of the United States. Although the Dulles period, because it was a crucial period, shows most clearly the failures of American foreign policy in Latin America, the situation was the same, both before and since Dulles, with a possible brief exception in the first administration of Franklin Roosevelt. Otherwise, American policy in Latin America has been determined by American needs and desires, and not by the problems of Latin Americans. A brief survey of these policies will show this clearly. There are four chief periods in United States policy toward Latin America in the 20th century. The first, a period of investment and interventionism, lasted until 1933, and was basically a period of commercial imperialism. American money came into Latin America as investments, seeking profits out of exploitation of the area's most obvious local resources, mineral or agricultural, such as copper, bananas, and petroleum, or as markets for American goods. There was little respect for the people themselves or for their way of life, and intervention by American military and diplomatic forces was always close at hand as a protection for American profits and investments. The Good Neighbor policy announced by President Roosevelt in 1933 reduced intervention while retaining investment. It was partly a consequence of the idealism and progressive nature of the New Deal itself, but was equally based on the fact that the need of Latin America for American investment funds and for the American market, especially in the depressed conditions of 1933, made it so amiable to our economic and commercial influence that there was little need for our use of diplomatic intimidation or the Marines. The third and fourth stages in America's Latin American policy, from 1940 to the present, have been concerned with our efforts to involve the area in our foreign policy, not theirs. That is, in the effort to get them as deeply involved as possible in the struggle against Hitler and Japan, and since 1947, in the struggle against the Soviet Union. Both of these efforts have been mistakes, with the possible exception of our relations with Brazil and Mexico in the period following 1940, because the states of Latin America, however dutifully they may have lined up in the hot war against Hitler or the Cold War against Soviet Russia, contributed little more to victory in these struggles than they would have contributed if they had not been pressured by us to line up at all. This four-stage chronology of American policy toward Latin America ignores completely the significant change that has occurred in the history of Latin America itself during the 20th century, chiefly in the 1950s. This is the shift in emphasis in Latin American history, especially in the history of political disturbances and governmental changes from the superficial coups d'etats that were prevalent in the 19th and early 20th centuries to the profound economic and social upheavals that first appeared in Mexico in 1910 and were followed in the 1950s by the revolutions in Bolivia, Cuba, and elsewhere. The failure in coincidence between the stages of the history of American policy and the stages of the history of Latin America itself is a fair measure of the irrelevance and futility of our policy. That this failure continued into the 1960s was clear in Washington's joy at the military coup that ejected the left-of-center João Goulart government from Brazil in April 1964. For that government, however misdirected and incompetent, at least recognize that there were urgent social and economic problems in Brazil demanding treatment. No real recognition that such problems existed was achieved in Washington until Castro's revolution in Cuba forced the realization. As a consequence, the Alliance for Progress should be regarded as the North American reaction to Castro, rather than its reaction to Latin America's real problems. This helps to explain why the achievement of the Alliance for Progress has been so limited. In its early announcement by President Kennedy during his second month in office, the projected Alliance for Progress seemed more hopeful than any earlier United States reaction to Latin America's problems had been. It accepted the idea of central economic planning for the Latin American nations and the role of state intervention in investment and economic life, both of which had been rejected by the Eisenhower administration. To these it added two other basic assumptions: that Latin America be required to take steps to help itself and not merely expect grants from the United States, and also that social improvements such as better housing, increased literacy, and improved social amenities be regarded as intrinsic parts of, or even prerequisites to, purely economic expansion, and not be considered, as hitherto, to be incidental consequences of such expansion. The formal agreement for the Alliance for Progress was signed by all members of the Organization of American States except Cuba, at Punta del Este, Uruguay, on August 17, 1961. Its aims and attitudes were admirable, but required implementation and organizational features that were not covered in the Charter itself, and have largely remained deficient since. Its preamble said in part, quote, "We, the American republics, hereby proclaim our decision to unite in a common effort to bring out people accelerated economic progress and broader social justice within the framework of personal dignity and personal liberty." Almost 200 years ago, we began in this hemisphere the long struggle for freedom which now inspires people in all parts of the world. Now, we must give a new meaning to that revolutionary heritage. For America stands at a turning point in history. The men and women of our hemisphere are reaching for the better life which today's skills have placed within their grasp. They are determined for themselves and their children to have decent and ever more abundant lives, to gain access to knowledge and equal opportunity for all, to end those conditions which benefit the few at the expense of the needs and dignity of the many. Close quote. These were fine words, and the specific detail to fulfill them was generally recognized. The latter included a substantial and sustained growth of per capita incomes at a rate designed to attain, at the earliest possible date, levels of income capable of assuring self-sustaining development, and sufficient to make Latin American income levels constantly larger in relation to the levels of the more industrialized nations. In evaluating the degree of relative development, account will be taken not only of average levels of real income and gross product per capita, but also of indices of infant mortality, illiteracy, and per capita daily caloric intake. The minimum desirable rate of economic growth was stated to be 2.5% per capita per year. It was, perhaps unrealistically stated, that economic progress should be made available to all citizens of all economic and social groups through a more equitable distribution of national income, raising more rapidly the income and standard of living of the needier sectors of the population, at the same time that a higher proportion of the national product is devoted to investment. This aim to redistribute income and achieve simultaneous higher consumption and higher investment is, of course, impossible, except in the most advanced industrial societies that have already reached such levels of consumption of material goods that further increases in consumption increase problems rather than solve them. To add to this rather confused idea of the process of economic development, the Charter immediately added, quote, "Special attention should be given to the establishment and development of capital goods industries." Close quote. Other desirable goals listed in the Charter included replacing latifundia and dwarf holdings by an equitable system of land tenure, to maintain stable price levels, avoiding inflation or deflation, and the consequent social hardships and maldistribution of resources, to strengthen existing agreements on economic integration, and to develop cooperative programs designed to prevent the harmful effects of excessive fluctuations in the foreign exchange earnings derived from exports of primary products. Among the social goals were to eliminate adult illiteracy, and by 1970 to assure, as a minimum, access to 6 years of primary education for each school-age child in Latin America, to increase life expectancy at birth by a minimum of 5 years, and to increase the ability to learn and produce by improving individual and public health, to provide adequate potable water supply and drainage to not less than 70% of the urban and 50% of the rural population, to reduce the mortality rate of children less than 5 years of age to at least 1/2 of the present rate, to control the more serious transmittable diseases, according to their importance as a cause of sickness and death, and so on. The methods of achieving these desirable goals were only incidentally established in the Charter. The participating Latin American countries were required to formulate, within 18 months, long-term development programs that would include improved human resources through education and training, a reform of tax structures, including adequate taxation of large incomes and real estate, laws to encourage investment, both foreign and domestic, and improved methods of distribution to provide more competitive markets. The drawing of such programs in areas that lacked adequate statistical information and had few trained economists was a considerable obstacle to carrying out the Charter, and only a handful of programs were approved in the first 3 years of the alliance. As part of the Charter, the United States offered to provide assistance under the alliance, amounting to $20 billion, of which half was to come from the government and half from private sources, over a 10-year period. Nothing was said in the Charter as to the nature of this assistance, but the government's share has been generally in the form of credits, the least helpful type of such foreign assistance, and the amount of such assistance has not, as might appear at first glance, amounted to $2 billion a year in new monies, since private American investments in Latin America already amounted to many hundreds of millions a year, and aid from the United States government was almost equally large, so that the total of additional assistance promised by the alliance was roughly about 2/3 of $1 billion or less each year. It would be possible to state the achievement of the Alliance for Progress in terms of hundreds of thousands of housing units, schools, new hospitals, roads, additional drinking water, and experimental or demonstration farms. But such lists, however large the numbers, indicate little about the success of the alliance. On the whole, it cannot be said that the alliance has failed, but even more emphatically, it cannot be said that it has been a success. Its achievement has been ameliorative rather than structural, and this alone indicates that it has not been a success. For unless there are structural reforms in Latin American society, its economic development will not become self-sustaining or even manage to keep up with the growth of population on the basis of income per capita. The failure of the Alliance for Progress to achieve what it was touted to achieve has many causes, but the chief is undoubtedly that it was not intended primarily to be a method for achieving a better life for Latin Americans, but was intended to be a means for implementing American policy in the Cold War. This became clearly evident at the Second Punta del Este Conference on January 22nd through the 31st, 1962, where Washington's exclusive control over the granting of funds for the alliance was used as a club to force the Latin American states to exclude Cuba from the Organization of American States. The original plan was to cut off Cuba's trade with all Western Hemisphere countries and to break off diplomatic relations as well. A 2/3 vote by countries was needed to make the recommendations official. It was obtained only by the minimum margin, 14 votes out of the 21 members, and only after the most intense American diplomatic pressure and bribery involving the granting and withholding of American aid to the alliance. Even at that, 6 countries representing 75% of Latin America's area and 70% of its population refused to vote for the American motions. These 6 were Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador. Much of the weaknesses of the Alliance for Progress arises from its failure to work for structural reforms that will change the patterns of Latin American life in more constructive directions. The aid, as we have said, is entirely under the control of the United States. It generally takes the form, not of money which can be used to buy the best goods in the cheapest market, but as credits which can be used only in the United States. Much of these credits goes either to fill gaps in the budgets or the foreign exchange balances of Latin American countries, which provides a maximum of leverage in getting these governments to follow America's lead in world affairs, but provides little or no benefit to the impoverished peoples of the hemisphere. Moreover, the grants which provide dollars to these countries are often counterbalanced by contrary influences, such as increased tariffs or other restrictions on the flow of Latin American goods to the United States, or decreases in the prices of Latin American primary products, or, what leads to the same results, increases in the export prices of American industrial goods. A decrease of a cent or two in the price that the United States pays for coffee can wipe out all the funds that it provides for the coffee-producing countries under the Alliance for Progress. For example, from 1959 to 1960, the price that the United States paid for its coffee fell from an average of 39 cents a pound to 34 cents a pound. This decrease of a nickel a pound would represent a decrease in the total amount the United States paid for coffee, from one year to the next, of more than $150 million for the 30 billion pounds bought in 1960. Similarly, a decrease of 1 cent per pound on Chile's copper means a loss of about $11 million a year. On the other hand, an increase in the prices of American television sets of $1 each costs Latin American buyers about $15 million. When both occur together, so that the prices of what Latin America sells are falling, while the prices that it has to pay for American goods are increasing, as has been generally true during recent years, it means that most of the funds that Washington extends to Latin America under the Alliance for Progress are evaporating before they can be used, in terms of the total amount of dollars available for Latin American purchases of goods and equipment needed to modernize the Latin American production system. There are many other aspects of this situation that help to explain the weak achievement of the Alliance for Progress. The tax reform projects, designed to force the rich to pay a fair share of taxes and to encourage them to invest rather than simply to hoard their surplus funds, have come to almost nothing. But the possibility that something of this nature might be done has caused large volumes of funds to flee from Latin America, to seek shelter abroad. It is possible that the total of such Latin American funds hiding abroad may amount to as much as $20 billion, the same amount the United States promised to provide over the whole 10 years of the Alliance's projected life. While we have no accurate figures on the sums, an official report gives $4 billion as the amount of Latin American money on deposit in the United States at the end of 1961. All of these considerations make it clear that problems of our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere are still rising more rapidly than they are being solved, a condition equally true in Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Near East. In all of these, failure to find some answers to the problems that are rising can only lead to neutralism, eventually hatred of the Western world, and violent explosions by disappointed peoples that achieve nothing constructive either for them or for us. There are those who say that all these disappointments are inevitable because the problems of the backward areas are basically insoluble. To these skeptics, we need only say, look at the Far East, where, in vivid contrast, we can see the outstanding case where the problem of development has been solved, and the most frightening example of what may happen when it is not solved.